I'm John Byrne from AML Right Source, and today I have the pleasure of talking to David Tyree. David is a senior advisor in financial crime detection and AML at Valid 8. He's also a retired DEA agent for decades, and there's a combination of things we want to talk to David about, both about his career, but also what he's doing today and some of the key issues that we all face, from fraud prevention to all sorts of other topics that we're all grappling with. David, thank you so much for taking the time. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, John, for the opportunity. I'm so excited for today. Thank you.
So, a couple things, and we'll talk about what you're doing now. But I'll give us a sense. Was it almost 25 years at DEA? Did you reach
Yes.
25? Yeah. Okay. So,
Yes.
so 25 years at DEA, and as we both know, and I come from decades of working on this, it was a lot different way back when you were first an agent to deal with money laundering issues. Mainly, I assume at that point was drug trafficking. What's been the biggest change over time besides technology? We were aware of that. We know about crypto. What's the biggest change from when you started as an agent to the tail end of your career in the financial crime prevention and investigation space?
A great question. There were a lot of changes I can point back to when I first started. It was a lot easier with regard to asset forfeiture and money laundering investigations. What changed was DEA's access to FinCEN, the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, where initially we were using our intel analysts to sort of conduct searches and queries and whatnot. And then it was on our own computers. And once we were able to actively search through FinCEN, it started building relationships I think I made in 2001, that I still have today with financial investigative units really all over the country. Because what I learned quickly was they in the banking industry knew way more about the data, about the levers and controls within that data and how to action it. So, yeah, I'm an idiot, John. I would fly out and meet with these FIUs and say, please explain to me what it is you're seeing, and then help me articulate it to the leadership within DEA and obviously to the courts. So, that I think the relationships have changed quite a bit because we're so much more behind our computers. And that's something I'm always encouraging uh, police, at least, to do TTP, to go talk to people. Like, it's okay to leave the office and make that relationship.
That's really important and really funny that you say that, because I feel the same way. People don't even talk on the phone anymore. It used to be that if you were working with a law enforcement partner, I spent a couple years at a bank. If you couldn't go in person, you pick up the phone, you talk to your contact. Then it became, oh, email. Now it's maybe text, maybe, or an app that you're using, and that's certainly by definition just creates this wall,
Mhm.
and it happens in society in general. We know that. I mean, it's pretty. You have adult kids. I have adult grown kids. We don't talk on the phone. We text. That
They
kind of
text
thing.
me, yeah, they text me grocery lists and where to Venmo or what to Venmo.
That's
Back to it though, John. I seen when I got towards retirement, we had such great relationships, and I give our state and local counterparts a lot of credit for that. When there was a traffic stop on the interstate in Wyoming, the state police would call the state or call me directly with simply, "Hey, this is the amount of drugs. Here's his bank card, and here's the bank card number." We were emailing the FIUs or the law enforcement support at these different institutions, simply saying, "There's been a traffic stop in our state. There was an undetermined amount of illegal narcotics located. The driver had this bank card, this number." Without I can't think of a time where the financial institution didn't circle back with information, usually via SAR, and we were able then to take that information and demonstrate pattern of life to the prosecutor, showing like, look, this isn't a one time. This is not, in fact, the driver's first time. This is, at least from the bank records, this driver's traveled cross country 7 times in the last 6 months. And what we had was this pattern of life. Now, John, you and I think alike. We're always thinking about what's the cost here? What's the ROI? Well, in the discovery process, and then in the potential litigation, we were reducing costs to the government by saying, "Look, we're not going to have to go to trial on the defense that he was an innocent owner, didn't know it was in the car. We can demonstrably demonstrate through bank records that this has happened before." And so, I guess I keep going back to it. And when I left, I kept trying to preach to my teams like, witnesses don't remember things. I'm not going to use the word lie. Police sometimes remember things wrong. Bank records don't lie, period. They tell a story.
Yeah, in fact, as you know, when I reached out to you and we scheduled to do this, I saw since I reached out to you, you posted a piece on LinkedIn regarding bank records as evidence and the value proposition there. And as you said, that was something that was important to you 25 years ago and still important. So expand a bit on that. I mean, obviously, we understand the premise that records are factual reporting of what it is that you're looking for, but talk a little bit more about the value of records, whether they be SARS, whether they be cash reports or anything else. I will just and I have a follow-up about thresholds, but talk a bit about the value proposition that you saw when you were in law enforcement and you still see today when you work with clients.
Sure. Well, we're meaning making animals. So, and a picture is worth 1,000 words. And so, the different forms that are available, for example, the IRS Form 8300 for a cash purchase over $10,000. Johnny already mentioned I have 3 kids. Do you think I've ever even seen $10,000? I don't even know how to type it. So when you start reviewing IRS Form 8300s from, say, car dealerships, I believe I seized or partook in the seizure of 26 different vehicles, brand new or slightly used, based off of not just those forms, but going into the dealerships and saying, "Hey, you're not being targeted, but cash is king in the criminal underworld, and bad guys often know about these forms." Do you ever see someone coming in, say, with $9,000 and putting cash down? This happened on multiple occasions where then the dealerships were calling us. We would cover that interaction with a subpoena for, let's say, all car deals over the last 7 days. We knew what we were looking for. And we used that vehicle purchase with suspect money. We would leverage the information from the car deal, which, believe it or not, you're going to look at the Equifax, TransUnion, credit history report, where they bank. And we would try and tell a story and get beyond. I mean, trust me, we called it the lust for the bust. So, hey, let's just go seize their car. And some of us would say, well, wait a minute. If we can take the car, perhaps we can take the bank account. If we can take the bank account, and I give credit to a great IRS CI agent, he said, David, then we can take the 4 houses the bad guy has bought with drug proceeds. So we took a very small $1,200 cash seizure from looking at bank records, seized and forfeit over $600,000 from the accounts, and 4 pieces of real property. Forfeit, paid for in 3 years by a drug trafficker in a small community. My issue, John, is people are making a profit off the misery of others, period. Whether it's human trafficking, drug trafficking, the addicted community. I feel like as law enforcement and banks, we are supposed to be the good ones, the good people. And so we have to collectively combat that and really make a story that stands up to a prosecutor who wasn't there. And that's where I believe juries understand rent payments, mortgage payments, car payments. I don't know that they understand 600 pounds of methamphetamine off the interstate because we don't get a chance to tell them how long that would last, right? But when you start telling a jury about the trafficker's money movement, I think now all of a sudden the jury gets a picture of the life that this individual is living because, they're usually maybe not telling that story. It's our job to tell that story. And that's where I believe the bank records come in. And to my own point, it's also, they can be exculpatory, John. The bank records can be exculpatory. And when we're talking about limited resources in law enforcement, why not do a financial crimes field test? Hey, we looked at 6 months of bank records. This individual doesn't seem to be doing much that we can see. Is this really the highest and best use of our limited resources?
This might not be a fair question because you are obviously not a banker, but one of the age-old debates that I've been involved in, I worked for the banking association for years in a bank and so other was the whole question of when an account gets opened, and so the bank is doing its due diligence on the customer, regulators expect that you're going to put in the files expected activity. And some
Mhm.
bankers have said, and a lot of bankers that I respect have said, that's really not going to help because A, they might not know because it's a new business. B, they might lie. And C, they just hadn't thought about it. So wouldn't it make more sense to do actual activity after a period of time? So in other words, you open up an account for a small restaurant in some small town, and 3 months later, you get by looking at the data, looking at the records, you think, well, hey, it doesn't look like this restaurant's very busy. The dollar amounts seem very high. They're getting high dollar amounts like midweek, which is not an active time for restaurants. So wouldn't it be more valuable to law enforcement than expected activity where you just sort of come up with a number? Maybe you do some research, but you come up with a number, you put it in there, and then you base your analysis off of that. Now, yeah, again, you probably could do some stuff on the front end that would be accurate, but that's the debate that compliance officers seem to have. Like, why are we doing this when we should do it? Now, again, you're going to miss something for a period of time by definition, 3 months or 6 months. But if that customer hasn't closed out the account, they're still there. So, do you have a view on that at all?
John, I do because you're talking to a guy who wrote a seizure warrant for 66 different bank accounts tied to restaurants. So you actually must have read about this one online. What was so fascinating, and yes, to your question, and I did get to do audit at the financial crimes unit of a bank, and what I noticed was their KYC on the front end was thorough. When and if there was a change, obviously an increase in money movement, the next piece of that puzzle was client outreach. As law enforcement, I never subpoenaed the recorded calls referred to as client outreach. So now, to your point, if the customer's lying, it's really nice to have that recorded call as a piece of evidence. And then I guess to finish with that, when I was doing that investigation, and there were a lot of great banks that helped, they filed suspicious activity reports on money movement pursuant to my contact with them, saying, look, this seems to be like a lot of cash coming into the account and leaving quickly. Several of the banks initially filed. And then on that, when they did the 60-day review, I said, listen, if you have like industry within your institution, maybe you could reference that in your SAR and that becomes part of the supporting documents, which was very.
What do you mean by that? What do you mean by that?
Oh, great question. So there, in my specific case, these were independent restaurants that were doing fast food essentially.
Okay.
The banks had other like industry within their banking.
Gotcha.
And when they said in their narrative, like, listen, there's a lot of cash coming into this restaurant, unlike other restaurants we bank, when they reviewed the SAR, they included the bank account number and of that other restaurant. They did not file it or include it in their SAR, but it allowed me to then subpoena those bank records and then make a informed argument to the court saying, listen, I've looked at bank records for a like industry within 100 miles of my target account and target restaurant. According to this information that I've analyzed, I'm seeing that these are 10 to 15% cash intensive. However, when looking at target restaurant, it's 65% cash intensive. That gives law enforcement that edge to make an informed decision because you don't want to go talk to other restaurants necessarily. And if you do go talk to them, it's like, what are you going to ask them? I hope I answered your question because I think your question's really smart. It's both, and I think that's probably my mantra these days. It's called both and. It's both important to do this on the front end. It's important for KYC, and it's really important maybe at 6 months to do a look back. And if it's not consistent, maybe you start with your customer. You have that conversation, you articulate what it is they're telling you, and then maybe you flag it and you look a year later. Does that make sense? You're creating an audit trail essentially for regulators
Sure.
saying, "Hey, we did this."
Sure. Like I said, on the front end, it's never going to be potentially as accurate as 3 months or 6 months in,
Mhm,
because then you obviously have an experience there and,
mhm.
maybe they expected to do X, but they ended up doing Y because they made a change in product delivery or whatever. I
Sure.
mean, it could be that. It makes sense, but I think your larger point is that connective tissue with law enforcement
Mhm.
helps the due diligence be much more valuable. So I think that's
Yeah.
where it's up to the financial institution as well as it up to the law enforcement partner to connect. And once they're doing that, then they're sharing their different but related experiences to make that data much more useful. So
Exactly. And I don't think it's fair on either side to expect the other one to do 90% of the work. So
right.
after working both in law enforcement and within the financial institution, there is a space in the middle where law enforcement, you need to understand the banks aren't going to burn your case. They may want to close the account because they feel exposed, and there's a remedy with a keep open letter. But that comes from that communication, and you might, as a cop, be speaking with an investigator, and a leadership or management says, "Hey, we got to close this account." It's really incumbent upon that investigator to call law enforcement, say, "Hey, can you get me a keep open letter?" And some police might say, "I have no idea what that is." Well,
Right.
guess what? It's online. You can find it.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, Now that you've a couple of years uh, distant from your law enforcement career, I'm curious your thoughts on the following. There is a movement in this Congress, although I don't think they're going to have time to do it, but we'll see. But there's been some active conversation about the age-old issue of raising thresholds on reports. Um, I won't prejudice your answer with how I feel about it, but this is what I understand without seeing any language that they, meaning those that want to jump thresholds for cash reports, argue that 10 over 10,000 is a very low amount, but as you and I both said, that's still a lot of cash. But so they're thinking inflation brings it up to, I'm making the number up, I think 30 or 40,000. I've seen proposals as high as 75,000. So, which would mean, from an implementation standpoint, anything under those amounts wouldn't get reported. That's one I want your take on. The second is to jump the thresholds on suspicious activity reports from 5,000 to whatever. I know it's 5,000 if you know if you know the suspect, 25 if you don't, something like that. But they've been around since the mid 90s when they had SARS were first crafted. On the SARS one, I don't mind prejudicing your answer. I always felt that small banks think that those low dollar amount frauds, they want to report them in part because they want law enforcement to do something with it, even though they recognize the law enforcement might have its own thresholds because they have to by from a resource standpoint. So if you jump those, then the crimes under that amount don't get looked at all. But so on the two forms, get realizing that I'm sort of throwing this at you, and we didn't talk
No,
about
no, it's
this
fine.
but on the CTRs, again, been around since 1970, been at over 10 since then. Structuring is part of this and everything else. From a data standpoint, what's your thought if they were to raise the cash reporting thresholds?
Well, if they're going to do that, John, they have to do away with the leash law at parks, in my opinion, because at the end of the day, I view those forms as making bad behavior difficult.
Mhm.
And so it sounds a little bit closed off, but I've been in other countries and worked in other countries where the amount was $2,000. And the idea here is this. Let's look at fentanyl just as a crisis because there's so many overdoses. Those pills are selling for 75 cents, up to
Yeah.
$3 a pill. I have seen traffickers crush those same pills up and sell them as methamphetamine or cocaine as a gram for $100. So if we're really looking at trying to address fraud, drug overdose, human trafficking, I feel like it's maybe we're not doing the best job out there with the information as it stands, but I think that's a collaborative effort that we can all own and solve. Changing those thresholds, although that sounds like it might be easier for banks, I think you're then making it easier for criminals. And I just don't know why It's again, it's not like law enforcement doesn't have a subpoena process, but when
Right.
law enforcement knows how to action suspicious activity reports or currency transaction reports or 8300s, when they understand how to leverage the controls around those forms, because it's not just the amounts, John. It's now you've got your target's email address, the phone number. They never seem to give the wrong phone number to the bank,
Right.
where they lived before. And you're able to make a story. And what are we trying to say? There's a bunch of unexplained income, usually cash. I was on a call earlier today with law enforcement about crypto, and I said, "Listen, let's look at their bank records first before we get into the blockchain. Can you show me the dirty account?" And when they pulled that up, I said, "Oh, now I can see hiding money in plain sight. It was a residential concrete company. I can see they're depositing cash with checks and cashier's checks the guy was buying in his own name from other banks. You've got money laundering here because
Mhm.
you're telling me he's a drug dealer." Now, when he moves it onto Coinbase, we can talk to Coinbase. We can figure out what that money's going. But you had to show me A before we could ever get to B, if that makes sense. And again, the thresholds there, there wasn't a SAR file. This guy knew everything we saw. $500,000 was under, I think the largest cash deposit was 7,200 bucks. So the bad guys know. So
Yeah.
you change it to 75 and they're putting in 73. Did we do a
Right.
great job? I mean, yeah,
No, you're still gonna have to monitor for structuring. So structuring
exactly.
is now at 60,000 or whatever, right? What about on SAR? SAR is a little different just given what that form is. And like I said, the dollar amounts have been low. We know that sometimes, and our good friend Steve Gerdak would talk about this, that sometimes the feds would say, well, that dollar amount isn't high enough for us to look at, but maybe the local police might look at it. So we always have that. But if you're not providing any of that data for those small dollar frauds, is that a problem from your perspective?
Absolutely. And again, it's that story of the kid walking down the beach throwing sand dollars back in the water, and the old guy says, "Ah, you'll never make a difference. There's 10,000 sand dollars on the beach." And he says, "Well, I did for this one." And he throws it in.
Yeah.
John, my stories are always from like where I made huge mistakes. I didn't look at a $1,200 seizure by the state. I didn't run the target in Finson. When I finally ran the target in Finson, 1,200 bucks he wanted back. We found over $600,000 in laundered money. That's the four houses. So a SAR to me and the data within that SAR is sort of that financial field test. It's like doing a field test of drugs on the street. You have to make an informed decision to articulate to leadership, to your team. Here's why we're doing this, guys. I got his bank records. There's actually a lot of money movement here. The SAR might be for $4,000 or $6,000, but our job, when we're being told, follow the money, and I'm always like, to what end? I'm like, action the money, seize the money. We look, there was just a case, it was in January. We had a driver in New Orleans crash into a group of people. If you dig into that a little bit, there was a lot of money movement, and the Iraqis actually detained somebody in Iraq from ISIS-K that was funding this activity. So
Wow.
is it a lone event? And that's where I feel like, look, there was a terrorist event a half block from my office in Boulder. And what's the money movement around this? We have to understand the money movement. There's some great books out there about how law enforcement partnered with financial institutions and they had impact. And I think you and I agree on a lot of things, but especially this notion of if we have a government, the government's function should be to protect its citizens, keep banks open and transparent so other countries want to bank in this country. And we have to it may feel like bumper sticker solutions, but we have to use those bumper sticker solutions around a very complex problem where bad actors making a profit off of the misery in our community are living with their profit. It drives me batty because I had to drive a minivan earlier in life. I don't know, just got under my skin.
I have two more topics that I want to quickly get to. I do recall when we connected back in March at our AML Partnership Forum, which we are going to try to do it again next year. Hopefully, we'll have enough law enforcement support to pull it off. But you had mentioned several things, but we talked about the fentanyl crisis and addiction and suicides. And I don't remember. I apologize. I don't remember the state, but I remember the region because you're in Colorado. But you were talking about states by you where the suicide number is off the charts. Talk a little bit about that. I know a lot is being done to deal with fentanyl, and at least this administration makes that a priority, which is a good thing. But talk a bit about that because those numbers just blew me away. I had no idea.
So I was resident agent in charge in for DEA in Wyoming, and the attorney general there, just phenomenal, and came to me because the suicide rate with adult males over 40 was really high per capita compared to the rest of the country. And so we got together and actually came up with some platforms and programs. We were going into high schools, and you've heard the whole dare, say no to drugs. What we talked about were actually sort of what drugs do to the brain and why people would want to numb pain, right? Childhood trauma. I didn't get asked to the prom. Boyfriend, girlfriend broke up. There's a lot that kids these days are going through with social media, and I'm not demonizing any of it,
Sure,
but it
sure.
was the attorney general's idea was, could we be the state that goes in and actually brings in mental health resource counselors to provide healthy alternatives? So here's David up there talking about fentanyl and just talking about the fact, like, listen, I get it. These drugs, you understand, they'll stop your heart. And we would have kids come up saying, where do I get them? Because they're going through their own lives, right? I mean, it's not just because our brains are fully formed at 25. You've got high school kids. So the mental health resource counselors got up after me and talked about sort of healthy alternatives and problem solving techniques that I wish I'd heard as a kid. The fentanyl overdose crisis around this country is a crisis, and it's because folks are they're not buying fentanyl, they're buying pain pills. They're
Mhm.
fake pain pills, oxycodone, Vicodin, codeine, and they're being pressed as fentanyl into these fake pills with no oversight. And so, if you've ever had an operation where you've needed some kind of opiate, usually you have oxygen. If you don't have oxygen, your heart's probably going to stop. And so
Right.
it's really tragic and sad because I've been the one to show up with some great cops, and you've got the deceased and you've got 5 or 6 family members completely wrecked, just completely devastated by this loss. And at the end of the day, I get angry talking about junk because someone made profit off of that. And when we talk about following the money and getting to the source, I'm teaching cops, grab the phone, search the phone, look at their peer-to-peer money movement. They're not that coded. They might not be asking for pills, but they're asking for ills. And you can, I'm telling you, those peer-to-peer money transfer services have been great for me to work with. They'll give you the account, the email address, and now you've identified the source.
Right.
And you bringing justice to the situation. Now, was a SAR filed, John, on $40 of pills? No,
Right.
never. But that's where I feel like that relationship between law enforcement and the banking community, when built, you start to see it because a banker looking at records says, huh, David's kind of been, normal money movement, money in, money out. Oh, all of a sudden I'm starting to see 40, 60, $80 going on to Zelle on a regular basis. This person might be struggling with addiction. Can
Mhm.
I file a SAR? It's under $5,000. Can I save a life? And that's not hyperbolic. I saw it. And that's where I feel like the good guys can actually have real measurable impact.
I'm gonna get you out of here on this, and I want to ask you about Validate. But first, the last question, I guess, is what do you see with all the work that you've done and are continuing to do? What do you see as the biggest challenge for our community, meaning the AML, CTF sanctions community, private and public, for let's just say for the next 5 years? What are the biggest challenges besides obvious ones like resources and technology and crypto? But what else do you see?
Polarizing. I see people going back to their corners and there's a clash of ignorance and it's become acceptable. Where law enforcement isn't out educating the banks on typologies, and the banks are not meeting with law enforcement to educate them on what they can and can't do, what they see. And law enforcement needs to understand this is not a profit center for the banks. And so they're doing this because they want to be a part of the solution. We did this, John, in Wyoming. We brought in 34 different banks. When I retired and I'm still on their text chain, 34 banks in the state of Wyoming. If they see fraud, they report it to each other in a text. If there's a suspicious person in Sheridan, Wyoming, 9 hours away from Cheyenne, there's a text. I just loved the fact that we put it together from an idea of money laundering and asset forfeiture, and it's still that, but it has graduated into this network of people that would never meet, speaking with one another. And to me, it's so that's the biggest challenge as we continue to gamify our lives on computers that we just don't go out and talk to people. I had a meeting with the Department of Revenue, and we talked for 3.5 hours over coffee. And the phone and text was, 2 lines. And we both said, this is so great. We got to do this more. So that I think is the greatest challenge.
So opening up communication back the way it was 20 years ago would be
Yes.
part of the
We
solution.
can do this. Look
Yeah.
at Star Wars, John. No one had phones in Star Wars. You ever dreamt with your phone in it? Doesn't happen. It's impossible.
Yeah, yeah. All right, thanks for doing this. Tell us a bit about Validate.
Sure. So Validate is a software platform that creates a storyboard flow of funds for money movement. I came to them after I did a seizure warrant, sent them the data. I'd had my data reviewed by a U.S. attorney's office, 2 financial investigators, myself. And within 24 hours, they found $1 million I missed. I've been chasing them ever since. They finally brought me on. I'm just out getting the message out that this platform is incredible. We're talking about SAR data. In about an hour, it can take your SAR data and give you a 1-page flow of funds. Here's where the money went in. Here's one out. It's always 1 click away from the source document. I'm fascinated by what it does, and I love collaborating with police in my role to make sure they get the data correctly articulated in affidavits.
David Tyree, when we first met, of course, being a Giant fan, I said, "Oh, the helmet catch guy." But obviously, you've done many, many other things that are valuable to society. But if people aren't already following you on LinkedIn, they should. Again, the company is Valid8. I want to thank you for taking the time today and keep up the passion, man. We really need it.
John, is my pleasure, and you drive that train. So know that the rest of us are following you. So we leave it to you to drive that, and we're right behind you, brother. We sure appreciate you.
Well, thanks for that.
All right.
Perfect.